we're so lucky to have Benjamin Legg here with us, who's going to lead us through this really fun and interactive experience. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ben.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So we are going to be trying to make this together as best we can. I see a couple of kitchens, so that's really exciting. For the people, a couple of my students already asked, will I also be doing this in such a way they can use a microwave? And the answer is no. But what I'm going to do right now is tell you what to do if you're using a microwave so that you can do it that way. So ingredients will be the same amount. The sources online that I have referred to about this said to use a sturdy and somewhat shallow round container would be the best thing, and microwave safe, obviously, so no metal bowls or flimsy plastic. And you are going to microwave it on high for 6 minutes, stopping it halfway and mixing it, and then you're going to put it back in for the other 3 minutes. So that is what the internet told me. I don't even have a microwave, which is a weird thing to reveal to you all, but now you know. So I don't know how that's going to work, but that is what I've learned online about how to make brigadeiros in a microwave. The best part about one of the recipes I read, it said 6 minutes or push the brigadeiro button. So that is clearly a Brazilian recipe that was written. That is designed for a Brazilian microwave right there. But let's get started. So I have here the 3 ingredients for brigadeiros. This is sweetened condensed milk, okay? 1 average sized can, which of course I took the label off and now I don't know how much that is, but I think it's 12 ounces. You might want to double check that. This is 4 tablespoons of cocoa powder, and I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in a second. And then you've got 3 tablespoons of butter. This is salted butter. If you use unsalted butter, you're going to want a pinch of salt as well, just to kind of balance out the sweetness, okay? For the cocoa powder, what I have here is a mixture of like good, healthy, unsweetened cocoa powder and the Brazilian version of Nesquik, which is called Nescau. In Brazil, people will often just use like a pre-sweetened chocolate drink mix, like Toddy or Nescau. Some people will also use unsweetened cocoa powder. Some people will use what they call chocolate en pó, which is a kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's a less sweetened version of sweetened cocoa, but it's still sweetened. So basically, there's a lot of room. The difference will be in how sweet it is. So if you use if you use the pre-sweetened thing like Nesquik or Nescau, then it's going to be a much sweeter brigadeiro in the end, and also a little stickier, like a little more caramelized. If you use unsweetened cocoa, it'll be less sweet and a little more chocolatey. Any questions on ingredients before I begin? Okay, so we're going to put these in this little saucepan. I would recommend something this is like the perfect size pan for this, but you want something that's deep enough that if it bubbles and splashes, it doesn't burn you, because that would be a tragedy. And it would also be painful. So we have our condensed milk. Try to get all of it out if you can. You don't want to waste.
Hey, Ben, we have a quick question on how much butter.
3 tablespoons. 3 tablespoons of butter, which actually, look at that. Put it right there. And then the cocoa powder. And then that is that for like classic brigadeiros. I was telling our colleagues before everybody came in here, there's a lot, like brigadeiros got really trendy about 5 years ago in a different way from normal. They were kind of more, there were a lot of like more artisanal brigadeiros happening. And there's a lot of things you can add to the recipe, a lot of flavorings you can add. Some of the things I have done is I've added coffee. You can, just not a lot, because if you add too much, it's going to be too liquid, but just enough to kind of give it a little flavor. You can add a little bit of vanilla. You can add different kinds of like alcohol or liqueur, like bourbon, or I wouldn't add cachaça because it just doesn't seem to go well with chocolate. But like something that would go nicely with chocolate, like a dark rum or amaretto or something. So yeah, that's what people do for brigadeiros to kind of make them fancy. Another thing people will do is use real chocolate instead of cocoa powder. I have to say, I don't really think it makes a better brigadeiro. And when we learn about the history of these, it kind of goes against the point because a lot of what the brigadeiro is a way of democratizing chocolate, which would have been expensive for the average Brazilian, to be something you could eat in your house based on cheap products you could buy. You know, so I think that that is an important part of this. So I've put all the ingredients in the pan together, and I'm just, can you see that I'm stirring? I can tilt down a little. And I'm just stirring. And on the heat, right now, I have it on a little bit above medium. So like, you could say medium high, but it's not like really medium high. And I'm gonna be taking it down a little, okay? But right now, we're gonna keep it there.
Ben, are all 3 ingredients in the stove top right now?
Yep. So everything is in the saucepan.
Okay.
Really easy. And what's going to happen, and you're going to maybe see it, but you might be a little too far away, is things are going to start to thin out as the condensed milk gets hot, you know, and kind of dissolves. And then it's going to start to thicken. And that's the trickiest part of making brigadeiros, is thickening it to the correct consistency, or as Brazilians say, chegar ao ponto, like when it gets to the point. So you want the brigadeiro to be at the right consistency, but we'll go look at that. So this is a good time for any questions, because I'm just going to be standing here mixing for, I would say 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how this is coming along. And once again, just I'll repeat, if you have to use a microwave for this, it is 6 minutes on high in a sturdy, round, kind of shallow container. Halfway through, you are going to stop it, take it out, mix it, put it back in. And then once it's done, you need to just mix it vigorously to make sure there's no lumps, okay? So that is how to do microwave brigadeiros. But I'm just, like I said, that's hearsay. I've never made brigadeiros in a microwave. I've never seen a magical microwave with a brigadeiro button like the recipe said existed.
When was the first time you ate a brigadeiro?
The first time I ate a brigadeiro, I was in high school in the States, in Massachusetts. And there was like a student organization did a like pan Latin American event night, and people all brought food from their respective, you know, cultures and countries of origin.
Don't stop stirring.
So it's true. So somebody brought, and actually at this point you don't have to be as serious with the stirring, but once it gets closer, you gotta watch out. So there's but the so somebody brought brigadeiros. And they also brought guaraná. I remember that vividly. It was also the first time I had guaraná. And then I went to Brazil probably about 2 years later. But yeah, that was the first time I had them. I didn't remember the name. Like, I remembered eating them at that event. And then when I went to Brazil, seeing them like in a bakery by the cash register and being like, those things with the sprinkles on them. And anything else? Anyone else have a question?
What kind of consistency are we looking for? Because mine sort of looks like it's just melted, like
yeah, that's fine for now.
Okay.
It should look. It's all right. This is for people that are. If you've ever had like really good Spanish hot chocolate, that's the consistency right now. It's like either a thin chocolate pudding or a very thick hot chocolate. Like that is where my consistency looks right now. That's not the final goal. The final goal is going to be something, I may as well describe it now, because if you're cooking at different heats or your stoves are different, your final consistency is something that is thick enough that when you pass your spoon through it, it leaves a trail. Does that make sense? And in Brazil, like the way I learned this is when you pass the spoon through it, you can see like you can pass through it to see the bottom of the pan. So that's really like the test point, so to speak, is that it gets thick enough that, you know, when you do this, which this is not at that point yet, that it leaves, you know, that it kind of parts the sea, so to speak, and you can see all the way to the bottom of the pan.
Okay, so one more question. Is it like caramel when you like reach that point, you've almost like ruined it if you're not careful kind of thing?
Yeah, and actually careful, like when you say caramel, that's a good, you don't want it to get as thick as caramel because when it cools down, it'll be a little bit too chewy and hard. So you want it a little bit, you kind of are going for the consistency, if you've ever made homemade fudge, of the fudge before you beat it up to break up the sugar crystals, if that makes sense.
Okay, gotcha. And
but
should we have something like, I feel like I am, but should we have something like prepared to put it on, like a plate or what?
Yes.
Like where
Okay. This is like the best learned by doing. So I have such a plate. What I would tell you to do is to grease a plate. You don't have to grease the plate. I just feel like it helps. Like it makes it easier to get everything off of the plate. So you can grease a plate to pour it on. And what that will accomplish is, like I said, just making it easier so it doesn't stick and that you'll be able to get some. So this is like, for me, it's starting to steam quite a bit, and I mean, I've made a lot of brigadeiros in my day. I can feel it starting to thicken. I'm gonna lower the heat all the way down to low, like as low as it can be, and I'm gonna keep stirring it until it gets to that point. And I will bring the laptop down there closer right when it gets there, or maybe I'll bring the saucepan up there so you can see. So right now, though, if it starts to bubble or steam a lot, bring your heat down because you don't want it to burn, and but you do want it to thicken still. So I'm gonna keep going. Like I said, it usually takes 10 to 15 minutes. I would say, Karen, does that sound about right in your experience of brigadeiro making?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say 10 to 15. So we're getting towards there. Like I'm looking into the pan now, and it's starting to look very appropriate. But you know when it needs to get there. You also can feel it with your spoon. So like as you're mixing, you start to feel, especially towards the bottom of the pan where it's hottest, you start to feel it get, you know, harder. It gives you more resistance. And it's actually kind of funny because, you know, these are the things you learn, like as you make a lot of these things, it's like, oh, I can tell from the spoon. But you will notice it. You know, you'll notice like, oh, this is a little harder to stir. And you'll notice that for about the past minute, I really haven't stopped stirring. Like I was a little more casual about it, but we're at go time now. Like you need to be really careful because if not, it's gonna get lumpy and it's gonna get, it might burn, frankly. It might burn to the bottom. Okay, this is looking, I'd say we have about a minute to go, which is very exciting.
Hey, I have a quick question it's not
Sure.
cooking related so much, but so when do people eat brigadeiros? Do they eat them in
Children's birthday parties would be the number one most important answer, but beyond that, always. But
The best parties.
Like, it is not an appropriate, like it is not a good children's birthday party if there are not brigadeiros. And I'm going to show you beijinhos. So what I'm going to do is while we're waiting, this is almost ready, I'm going to tell you what the beijinho is. Imagine this same recipe, so the can of condensed milk and the 3 tablespoons of butter, but then instead of cocoa powder, you pour in a cup of grated coconut. And in Brazil, they don't have like the sweetened coconut flakes like you get in the States, so unsweetened grated coconut. And you do the same exact thing that I'm doing here, where you cook it until it thickens. The difference is that I find the beijinho mixture cooks faster, probably because it's thicker. Like the coconut is thicker, or the coconut, it makes it more solid. So I find the beijinho mixture cooks faster, and also you can see it burning more because it's not got chocolate. So you might freak out. Matt Marino, should it be the consistency of, is he pudding, did he say? That is it. And actually, I'm going to give mine a couple more seconds, but mine is getting there. It should look like not fully set pudding, basically. Like pudding that you couldn't unmold, like pudding that you would have to eat out of a dish. So like not like poutine, not like flan, but like pudding in a bowl. That would be a good description. And that is exactly how mine looks right now. And I'm going to say this is ready. So let me show you. Can you see? Can you see this consistency? And then look, when I pull the spoon through, does that work? I can lower it. There we go. Right?
So should it be the consistency of pudding, Ben? Is that a good?
Yeah, so this looks pretty puddingy right here, right? So that is what we want. I'm gonna get the greased plate and put this on it, and then we will move into the other room and I'll show you how to assemble. All right, so what I'm gonna do, I have got this in there. Let me get the spatula and kind of get the rest out of the pan to just, not be wasteful. And then here is where this gets harder for you. So you're gonna stop participating and start watching, and we can converse a little more. You are gonna need to let this cool, depending on your heat tolerance, for about an hour, I would say. You could probably go less than an hour if you really, really were in a hurry, but I would put it in the freezer. Like imagine you're on Great British Bake Off and you have to get a jelly to set really quickly. So if that's the case, you're gonna need to put it in the freezer. And and you want to see now, Marina? Yes. But that's what you're gonna need to let this sit. And I am going to, in the meantime, show you how to put them together. And then you will come back with that knowledge and be able to make your own brigadeiros in about an hour. So one moment. This is how it looks on the plate right now, okay? It's slightly mobile, but it's not tipping onto my laptop, It's just there. And I'm gonna set that aside to cool because we have a whole Julia Child style mise en place here for me to show you what we do to assemble brigadeiros, okay? Cute, cheeky indeed, Erin. So first things first, I have a dish of water here and some soap, but wash your hands because you're gonna use them, okay? Secondly, get a little butter or oil or shortening and use that I just want to tip this a little more. There you go. So you can see that better. So you have your hands are nicely greased, and then you're gonna take, now there are people that will use spoons for this. I'm not doing this. Marina, I didn't put that plate in the fridge because I'm gonna let it rest an hour, okay? But this plate here that I'm working with now has been out for cutting, what, about 2 hours? Does that sound right?
Sim, acho que sim.
2 hours. Cutting watched me make these the first time to make sure the angles were right. So you can, she was part of the production process. So what you want is, to let it rest. And I'm gonna do this one more time because I was kind of talking, and we're gonna do this one more time here. So you're gonna I am taking what is about a teaspoonful, okay? Can you see? We are gonna roll, okay? This here is a dish of chocolate sprinkles. Other options, if you don't have chocolate sprinkles, would be just chopped up chocolate, cocoa powder, okay, like for truffles, but the real version is chocolate sprinkles. And then you're going to roll, actually, let me do it so you can see it. Just roll that brigadeiro in there, okay? And I have here many little paper cups. These from Brazil, because the American ones I don't think are small enough. And what you do is just kind of nestle it. And we're going to keep doing this, or you're going to keep doing this until you have a full platter for your birthday party or lonely night in or class of Portuguese students who have done well on their projects and deserve a treat. But there's all kinds of things we can use them for. But I want to show you another one. So I talked about the beijinho, the coconut one. This is that. Okay, this is the beijinho mixture. So this is the same exact thing. It is a can of condensed milk, 3 tablespoons of butter, and then 1 cup of grated unsweetened coconut. You can use sweetened coconut. In Brazil, that's not what they have, so it's just not the same. And then once again, same as with the brigadeiro, take about a teaspoonful, roll it into the ball. Look at how beautiful and smooth that got. Here is, like the chocolate sprinkles, this is more grated coconut. So you can roll it in the grated coconut, okay? Put it in the little ruffly cup. And then the classic garnish for this, and this is really important to make it look right at your child's birthday party, is a whole clove.
Eca.
And you pocket it and you put it right in there. And another option for rolling it in, and it really is, this is not as like padronizado, for lack of it, like it's not as specific as with the chocolate sprinkles on the brigadeiro. I've also seen people roll them in sugar. It really doesn't, it seems to be kind of personal preference, So that is the beijinho and the brigadeiro. Go for it and give me your questions while I'm rolling these. And then I have about 10 to 15 minutes worth of a little history lesson to give you. And then maybe by the time that's over, if you've put the brigadeiro mixture in the freezer especially, it might be set enough and cool enough to start rolling your own. Okay? So any questions before I move on to the PowerPoint?
Yeah, Joy, would you like to ask your question to Ben?
Okay, so I love coconut.
Yeah.
The idea of the whole clove.
Yeah.
Do you eat the whole clove?
No, you take it out. Yeah.
Okay.
People do it on dares. So we were talking about it being on children's birthday parties. Imagine it's a 12-year-old cousin's birthday party and they're trying to show the counting chicken that is when that happens. Okay. But the whole clove it's just there to make it look vaguely like an eye. I think that, because there's also another docinho like this called an óleo de sogra, which I didn't make for you, but basically you take the beijinho mixture and you stuff it into a prune and make it look like óleo de sogra literally means mother-in-law's eye. So yeah, that is what that one is. And there are, and you'll see this in the little PowerPoint I made, there are dozens of docinhos. You call these docinhos, little sweets. The most common one, other than brigadeiro and beijinho, I'd say, is called cajuzinho. And even though it's called cajuzinho, which would mean little cashew, it is made from what, do you think? Anybody want to guess? Peanuts. So it's just because that makes sense. And then there's another one that's pink. And, I guess maybe way back in the day before convenience foods, people made it from maybe nice pureed strawberries, but nowadays you make it from a packet of strawberry crystal light or clyde, and it is called a bicho do pé. So that is the pink version. But there's a lot of different docinhos, based on condensed milk. Any other questions?
Joy, you want to go again?
Yeah, I love to ask questions. Can you share a little of the history you alluded to at the beginning of the meeting?
I think that is the perfect segue to yes. So let me, I'm going to just switch over from the the sticky, messy part of my dining room table to the, if you've been my student, the formal view of my dining room table. And we are going to go through a little bit of a PowerPoint, and I will tell you about not just the history of Brigadeiros, but of kind of sweet making in Brazil in general, okay? So here we go. This is sweetness in Brazilian history. So as you can see, the Beijinhos, these ones I did make with sugar. God, I must have made them. Oh, and the really good Brazilian sprinkles. Anyway, I'm like looking at my Brigadeiros with saudade. But these are, so yeah. So sugar and sweets is a really important part of Brazilian culture. I mean, sweets and candy and specialties like treats are an important part of any culture, but sweets in particular and sugar in particular is very important in Brazil because of its history. So in the year 1516, so just 16 years after the Portuguese first arrived in Brazil in 1500, the first sugarcane is planted on the island of Itamaracá in Pernambuco, okay? This is a momentous occasion because it grows really well there. And the Portuguese are really, they feel like they're onto something. So what happens is over the next 100 years, and for anybody who's taking my film class right now, you would know this very well because we've just done a whole unit on this. Over the next 100 years, what is now the northeast of Brazil, so the captaincy of Pernambuco, and then Bahia, and then a couple of other states in that part of Brazil, become the world center of sugar production. So this is where the most sugar in the world is being produced. The first African slaves are brought around 1540. They say sometime between 1538 and 1542. So very early in this process. And by 1600, there are over 250 sugar plantations in Brazil. So this is a very early history, right? And it's going back deeply. And by the end of slavery, IBGE, which is like the Brazilian Census Bureau, or Statistics Bureau, estimates that over 4 million enslaved Africans have been brought to Brazil. And there are scholars that estimate it was far more than that. This is just IBGE. So as we go on, Gilberto Freire, whose house you just saw on this slide, that was Gilberto Freire's home. Gilberto Freire was a very important Brazilian intellectual, sociologist specifically, who wrote a book in 1933 called Casa Grande e Senzala, or The Masters and the Slaves. And in this book, he places kind of the origin point of Brazilian civilization, or specifically tropical civilization in Brazil, on the sugar plantation. So he sees the plantation and the culture that's built around enslavement and built around kind of the interactions between slaves, masters, clergy, other kinds of workers in the area. This is like where Brazil is formed, so to speak, in the eyes of Freire. And the reason I bring up Freire specifically, he's not the only person that said this, but he is the most influential person, is in 1939, he publishes a book called Açúcar, which is documenting the role of sugar in Northeastern culture. It features more than 100 recipes. And in an article I finished a couple of years ago, I actually like categorized, it's like 62 cakes, 12 ice creams, 18 jams, But it's like, it's a very like, it's a very well-documented book. And he has a very strong belief that sugar and sweets are essential to Brazil's national identity and specifically to Northeastern culture, okay? Moving on, so, you know, we see sweets being connected to the plantation, connected to sugar agriculture. This is something that we see in contemporary African-American arts. So Carol Walker, who is a conceptual artist and visual artist, did a huge exhibition about sugar in the old Domino refinery, I believe it was, in Brooklyn. So this is like the role of sugar and slavery is a well-documented trope. Sidney Mintz was an anthropologist who wrote about it in the 1980s in a book called Sweetness and Power. That's where I get the title of this. But I also want to kind of highlight the flip side that there was a way in which sweet making also brought some liberty, some freedom, which was through the sale of sweets and street food by were called the Candomblés, which are Afro-Brazilian religious communities. And this is a very iconic image in the state of Bahia. There's a lot, this is like something that goes both ways. There is negative in this image as well, you know, there's something that is considered somewhat reductive about it. But at the other side, if you really look into the history, this manufacture and sale of street food and of sweets, right here we have what are called cocada, which is coconut candy that's just made from sugar and coconut. So that's not like the beijinho that has the milk, the condensed milk, it's just sugar and coconut. And so this was a way that Afro-Brazilian religious communities were able to fund themselves. It was a way that women were able to save money, to try to be entrepreneurial. So there is, you know, it's not only the history of violence, it's also survival, right? With the way sweets are in Northeastern history and in Brazilian history. Moving on, this is just the savory food that is most associated with the street food sellers are acarajé, which is a fried cake, a fried ball made out of black-eyed peas, and abará, which is the steamed version. And those are very iconic foods, and they come direct from Yoruba cuisine, like from Nigerian cuisine, but specifically Yoruba cuisine. And akara is a fritter made of black-eyed peas that is consumed today in much of the Western Hemisphere through the history of enslaved Africans having been brought, but also maintaining these culinary practices. So acarajé is the Brazilian variant. In the French Caribbean, so Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Haiti, they just call it acla. And it's made of the same recipe. The only difference is the accompaniment. So in Bahia, you always have acarajé with shrimp, vatapá, which we're not going to ever make vatapá on Zoom because that is a process, and some kind of chopped up raw vegetables. Okay, and this is just to show that in 2006, IFAM, which is kind of the Brazilian Patrimonial and Historical Institute, recognized acarajé and the women making acarajé as a marking trait of the history and resistance of Black people, in particular Black women in Brazil. Okay? Moving on to the 20th and 21st century, just some pictures from bakeries and from some delicious beijo moleque that I made just 2 months ago. We can look at another major innovation, which kind of shows certain globalization, which is sweetened condensed milk. As you've noticed, all of these desserts have sweetened condensed milk, as do almost all Brazilian desserts. It is a very, and I have been told this is common in other parts of Latin America as well. So sweetened condensed milk has been wholeheartedly adopted as an ingredient, but this is something that was not introduced to Brazil until 1921 by the Swiss corporation Nestle. But by the 30s, there's already a condensed milk cookbook. So like it's one of the first cookbooks published in Brazil is published by Nestle with recipes for condensed milk, which is really interesting. And I remember my grandmother in the States had like the, what's the brand of baking powder? The Rumford baking powder cookbook. So it was like one of these kinds of things. And then during and after the Second World War, there's a massive boom in condensed milk sales, and the Brigadeiro was popularized. And just to throw this question out there, thinking about the world and climate and economic conditions, why do you think condensed milk was so popular in Brazil in the 40s? Why do you think this would have been something that would have just, you know, it wasn't just a cookbook that was published. Does anybody want to try to take a guess before I tell you? So Brazil is a tropical climate. Milk spoils very quickly in a tropical climate. By condensing milk with sugar, you're able, the dairy farmers and then also the, you know, people that are that are urbanized, that are moving away from the countryside and away from their cows and are moving to the cities to work in factories, are able to get milk. And this is a time when a lot of people wouldn't have had refrigeration, right? Oh, why is mossa used on the can? I just looked at the questions, and let me move into that really quickly. That is a Nestle thing. That's a Nestle branding thing. But back to like why condensed milk itself became so popular, it was a way for people in a rapidly urbanizing country to, you know, still get milk and get the milk that they would have used to make desserts back in, you know, whatever regions they might have come from. And this is before people could afford refrigeration easily. So it's something that doesn't spoil. It's shelf stable, right? You buy condensed milk, you know, out on the shelves. The Mossa herself is a Swiss milkmaid because Nestle is a Swiss company. And when this brand itself first came out in 1905 in Switzerland, and it was called La Laitière, so the milkmaid in French. And in German, Milchmädchen, I don't do German, but it was but that was the German, because Switzerland, you know, you have French and German. So when they brought it to Latin America, in Brazil, it was Moça, which means literally girl. And then I'm sure you recognize this brand if you've been in Spanish America, or what is it called? And actually, if you buy this brand in the US, usually it is this name as well. Anybody know? La Lechera. So there's La Lechera, sweetened condensed milk, which is what they sell in Mexico, Argentina, Chile, places like that. Moving on, and I'm about wrapping up, to get to the name of this dessert. So the Brigadeiro itself is named after Air Force Brigadier Eduardo Gomes, a politician from the 1940s. There's some interesting stories about how it got the name. So women received the vote in Brazil in the 30s. So women were recently kind of organized into political campaigning groups, kind of like the League of Women Voters in the US, but in Brazil. And apparently the legend is that the women who were in Brigadeiro Gomes' campaign would organize like sales of sweets, including brigadeiros, and that's how the name happened. Okay, and there is one woman specifically, Heloísa Nabuco de Oliveira, who's been her daughter was interviewed on Globo, on like the big Brazilian channel. So like this is the story that's probably most widely disseminated. And she was supposedly the inventor. She was one of the members of these groups and was the inventor. But there's other people who say they were inventor. There's other people that say it was a recipe that was already invented by Nestle, even though I did not find it in that cookbook. There's people that say it was invented in Rio Grande do Sul, where they call it by a different name. So there's a lot of history, but this is something post-World War II, and the name does come from Brigadeiro Eduardo Gomes, whose campaign slogan was very sexistly, "Vote no Brigadeiro, que é bonito e solteiro." Vote for the Brigadier because he's handsome and single. For real, that was his slogan. And then finally, regardless, it became a fixture of Brazilian cuisine. And by 1965, there's several variants in Brazilian Cookery by Margarete de Andrade, which is the first Brazilian cookbook in English published. So by the time that book is published for a US audience, this is like firmly established as a common Brazilian sweet. So it's actually a pretty fast process, about 20 years. If we ever get a chance to do this about pão de queijo is a similarly really fast story. So, but we'll go into that another time. So yeah, just, you know, joys and sorrows of Brazil's history at the table. Sweet and savory, shaped by the nation's history, the violence of the plantation, the challenge of freedom, the attempt to build a home away from home. I point out some immigrant dishes right here, Portuguese taverna, like tascas with Portuguese foods, Italian restaurants in São Paulo, Middle Eastern restaurants, which are very common in Brazil. Also a huge Japanese community. I personally had no pictures of Japanese food and I was trying not to break copyright, but you do, you know, have lots of Japanese food in Brazil as well. And then right here would be one of the traditional old egg and sugar-based sweets, you know, of the colonial era, as served at the Confeitaria Colombo, which is a very famous place. So all these elements appear on the table in Brazil, and that is the end of my presentation. Hopefully your brigadeiros have firmed up in the freezer, and you can try to make them. So questions?
We were wondering, how do you store it to keep it airtight, I guess, to keep it fresh? Would it be in an airtight container, or do you have to store it in the refrigerator?
You don't need to store it in the refrigerator. I would actually recommend against it because they get too sticky, like they get too firm if you put them in the refrigerator. I would store them in an airtight Tupperware or something like that. the reason for that would be to keep them from hardening on the outside. Like if you just let them sit out loose and you're not afraid of like flies and ants getting at them, the outside can kind of get crystallized. So if you keep them in Tupperware, that's less likely to happen. They're really shelf stable. Like Colleen was in Brazil with me 2 years ago, and like you see them everywhere just sitting out by the cash register. So, but they're usually sold wrapped in plastic or in bags. Dr. Joy Gus, I saw a message, a question, if you want to go into that.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that it was kind of like, it made me think of like making fudge at home with cocoa and sugar because going and buying fudge was expensive. What was going on? Why was it hard in Brazil for the
That was exactly what it was. So this is a time where industrialization in Brazil it's peaking, you know, it's growing a lot and very quickly, but it's much more focused in a lot of ways on, let's say, hard goods, like on cars and steel and textiles, and not necessarily on a lot of more consumer goods aimed at a middle class and an upper middle class, A, because there's not a large one yet, and B, because a lot of those products are imported from Europe. During the war, chocolate is a lot harder to get in Brazil because it's difficult, which means that making homemade, like you said, making fudge was because chocolate was expensive. Making a brigadeiro is a way of getting a chocolatey treat with easily purchasable, shelf-stable staple goods. Does that make sense? Yeah. And something I learned, like doing the research on this, Nutella in Italy. So like we associate Nutella so much with Italy, has a very similar history because in the war, chocolate got expensive and hard to make. So there was a recipe for something called gianduia, which is like a Milan specialty that was made of chocolate and hazelnut. And basically Nutella was an industrialized version of gianduia that used more powdered milk and vegetable oil than cocoa or hazelnut. So it was easier and cheaper to produce than chocolate, and it became, because it's sweet and delicious, just like brigadeiros, it became something that, as Margaret is tasting, it became something that was easily accessible. Does that answer your question, by the way?
Yeah. So is it something, though, that now is embraced by all socioeconomic levels or fancy restaurants, street markets?
Totally universal. And like I said, there's been a trend of like brigadeiro chique, like fancy brigadeiros, where like I'm gonna put in, you know, Kahlua and chopped up roasted hazelnuts, but it's still a brigadeiro. It's still made of sweetened condensed milk. It's still the same shape. But there was a big like fancy brigadeiro phase, maybe. I think right now, because the economy is not as strong as it was 10 years ago, it's less of a thing, but it was definitely a trend kind of at the big booming peak of the Brazilian economy. And not just in Brazil, in Portugal. Like I went to Lisbon 2 years ago and there was like a fancy brigadeiro store in the mall. So it was just like, I think it's Brazilian immigrants to Portugal, like establishing these businesses. But they were very like, you know, the Portuguese would say like giro or fish instead of chique, but it was like, you know, it's very cool. Like there was, so yeah, it's interesting how that has happened.